and welcome to the last and final panel for this year's conference. Just a reminder, we are combining the two sessions together. So we have 4 speakers in this last hour or so, and in order to leave room for questions and answers and interaction for the panel, I'm just going to go straight into inviting our first speaker. Dalia Fahmy will speak in Flux, U.S.-Egypt Strategic Interest and Military Relations Post-Arab Spring. And we're asking our speakers to have 10 minutes each, so we can have our conversation afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Good evening, everyone. Thanks for still being here and halfway awake. So the title of the panel is U.S. Foreign Policy, Neoliberalism, and Pact Theory. And Secretary Pompeo has just been confirmed, so a part of me just wants to say good night, everybody. But, okay, let me walk through the rest of the talk. Since the Arab Spring and the call for democratic reform, we all know, especially after the last panel, that all but one state has become pretty authoritarian and repressive in nature. And so what I want to look at is the case of U.S.-Egypt relations in light of U.S. foreign policy and how it's changed in the region, from what was so-called democracy promotion to now the perceived just basic stability maintenance, and how U.S. aid was traditionally used to mitigate this, and even that game has changed. And so when we think about U.S. foreign policy, especially towards Egypt, the question becomes, is it unclear? What is it exactly? But one strategy seems to dominate. It's that it's really better to get along with who's ever in power in order to continue some kind of security cooperation. And that's become the new paradigm of U.S. foreign policy. So when we think about Egypt and why we pay attention to it, it was Napoleon who said it's the most important country as the gateway both to Africa and the Middle East. But the way we also have come to look at Egypt, especially in terms of U.S. foreign policy, is having 4 primary interests. The first is maintenance of the Camp David Accords, U.S. military flyover rights, access to the Suez Canal, and more recently, anti-terrorism cooperation. And so Egypt, more than most other nations in the region, have this real interesting strategic importance to the United States. And so its stability has greater relevance to the way we think about regional stability, both militarily and ideologically. And so for decades, throughout various administrations, we've looked at how we actually negotiate this, engage this differently in the names of securing our interests. And so the relationship between the U.S. and these post-Arab Spring states has never really been unidirectional. So if we look at post-2011 and the Arab uprisings, before the uprisings, the U.S. had reduced its military aid or military presence, especially in Iraq, in terms of realignment on the war on terror, less military engagement. President Obama was moving his new administration into a foreign policy paradigm where diplomacy was going to lead. And in his 2009 inaugural address, he said, "To those who cling to power with corruption and deceit and the silencing of dissent, know that you are on the wrong side of history." And many of us have quoted this in our writing, signaling that it was going to be democracy that was going to be on the horizon. Add to that his Cairo speech and talking about a fresh start with the Muslim world. Little did he know that 2 years later, he was going to be recalibrating those very words at the United Nations, where he said, in terms of those commitments to democracy, the full force of the U.S. military was going to be behind what? Flyover rights, Sinai, counterterrorism, and all the other stuff, democracy promotion, human rights, that's where we could kind of negotiate. And so that happened within 2 years. And so it seems that the U.S. was taking a reactive approach, mitigating those rapid changes. And so when we think about the new perceived paradigm, even under President Obama, it was no longer about the democratic aspirations of people. Economic assistance, coordinating a stable exit strategy for dictators, by restraining and crumbling or contested regimes from turning violent, all of those started to become negotiated. And this type of paradigm shift was supposed to presumably both support U.S. ideals as well as interest in maintaining stability. And the mainstay of President Obama's initial foreign policy outlook. Now, Mubarak's era ended or signaled the decline of the regime's efficacy both domestically on its own population and in terms of its control of the military. And as I said earlier, and actually last night in another talk, at some point Mubarak became a liability to the military. And so here the question becomes, when there's military liability, how does the US engage with that actor, with that player? During the transition moment, as the army was stepping in, this enormous influence in society was becoming apparent, but also was at the international level becoming apparent. How are army generals, who had worked very closely with the United States since 1979, through several peace treaties and different accords and different interests, direct recipients of military aid, how is that relationship going to be the gateway to the new mode of democracy? So if you have a long-standing military relationship, and now the military is basically in power, how are we going to talk about democratic aspirations, democracy promotions, and rethink even the language of US foreign policy? And this is just in the interim time period. When the Islamist government of President Morsi is elected, the military relationship in Egypt still continued, but it was under this range of political issues that was going to test the friendship, test certain commitments. And although it lasted just 11 and a half months, the newly elected civilian president was going to supposedly rein power in from the military. And so when we're talking about reining power in from the military, how does US strategic alliance with the military change? How do we start to ask those questions? How do they start to see it? Now, so this move established basically President Morsi in certain regards as a threat to the military government, the military relationship, and the US finds itself in a position where you can't simultaneously hold military relations, Washington and Cairo relations, when they're not necessarily the same. And so we started to see a kind of language around US foreign policy that became duplicitous, right? And so we usually use that word to talk about other people. But here this word actually we have to rethink the way the language came about in terms of how we think about US foreign policy. So post-coup or post-coup and into the beginnings of the reign of President Sisi, we start to see democratic support go back to the argument of let's just deal with the devil we know versus the devil we don't know. The devil we know is a military authoritarian dictator, if that's what it is, and the devil we don't know is a democratically elected leader that becomes pretty messy at some point. And so American strategy became seen as perceived through those two competing demands, the aspirations of the Arab people, and the instability that might come from uprising versus the strategic interests that require stability. And the cost of stability might be a new dictator. And this comes from the problem with which we have in the United States measured foreign policy interests. Is democracy and stability two sides of the same coin? Do we have to choose one or the other? Stability or democracy, democracy being unstable. And that's the language that was emerging, but for the first time, it became very, very clear. And so the US responds at the time by suspending parts of the aid to Egypt. And so we started to see, for example, Secretary Kerry initially saying that there would be democratic preconditions that had to be met before military aid would be reinstituted. And what were the democratic preconditions? Parliamentary elections, presidential elections, and a new constitution. And the order was shifted, and then it didn't happen, and military aid was reinstituted again. And so we started to see is that even the kind of perceived commitments to the visibility or the visible preconditions of democracy were removed. And so the question becomes, yes, so in foreign policy we'd say it is a return to realpolitik, and that's okay. We are back into the realist paradigm. But for certain policy circles, this is not the only way forward. Abandoning the primacy of security concerns for political reform the argument has said has caused great insecurity. And so the road ahead has to rethink how we talk about strategic engagement. Egypt has such interests that historically have been perceived as if they're not that are not in keeping with US interests, and so we use aid to mitigate it. For example, aid is seen as a mitigator of Camp David Accord, as if maintenance of Camp David or US, Egyptian, Israeli interests are not actually in Egypt's interest, right? They actually are. And we saw that under the Morsi administration. So the belief that Egypt would even abandon these commitments misappropriates how we even think about Egypt's strategic goal in the region. And finally, we have been signaling a level of impunity to undemocratic actors in the region. And for several decades, this has been the case, but it's happening in a really interesting way today under President Trump. So, President Trump has said very interesting things, like when he had met President Sisi for the first time, of course, getting his phone call 3 days after he was elected, said that Sisi is a fantastic guy, even complimented the leader on his shoes. In turn, Sisi praises Trump for being a unique personality that is capable of doing the impossible. They embrace each other. This is not unusual, but when we start to see praise for authoritarian leaders around the world, talking about the backing of autocratic regimes has not just come back, but it's come back almost with a vengeance, not just in Egypt and the Philippines, but in many other places. Last month, when Egyptians went to the poll, which we all know was a farce election, it was the President Trump who said that the people were now distinguished, and this is the actual call of the aspiration of the Egyptian people. Trump administration officials praised the vote, and even the American embassy in Cairo tweeted, "As Americans, we are very impressed with the enthusiasm and patriotism of Egyptian voters." And so here we go back to the signaling of different things to people and to the regime, but now we might not even be signaling anything to the Egyptian people, that democratic aspirations no longer matter. And so the irony, or my concluding statement comes to 5 points, is that the irony remains that people have historically questioned whether Islamists would use democracy to reach power and then end it. But what we're seeing today is that this question pertains to far more people, right? Where there are individuals, military leaders, using democracy to attain power and then will remain in power. And we know that President Sisi, for example, has just been reelected in a sham election, but the Constitution will be amended for there to be an extension of term limits, and he'll be president forever. And so the language of one man, one vote that we used to attribute to Islamists might need to extend to others. This is not going to be his last election. But again, going back to the United States and our relationship with them, Sisi has made some pretty interesting stumbles. In North Korea, for example, in Syria with Bashar al-Assad, with Putin on the nuclear deal. And yet, we haven't slapped his hand so much on those. We thought we did last summer in terms of the withholding of a part of the aid, and it was supposed to be under humanitarian reasons, but it was because of the nuclear, the relationship with North Korea. But Sisi has remained remarkably resilient in that regard, and when we think about Western strategy in the hope that he would moderate his position on certain regards, this has proven to be a myth. And so it takes me back to this interesting thing that Churchill once commented upon. He said, appeasement is feeding a crocodile hoping it will eat you last. It's not clear what this administration in terms of Egypt is doing vis-a-vis the United States. Obviously, Egypt cannot hurt the United States in the sense of appeasement, but it has slapped us in the face a few times. It has done a couple of things that have not been in our strategic interest in relationship with them. And so the question becomes, why do we play this game with them? Why do we allow them, or the Egyptian administration, to play this game with us? What has led to our lack of consistency, even in our language, in terms of the relationship with Egypt? We have for so long thought that there is no alternative for them except to engage with us. But why is it that we no longer leverage our power vis-a-vis a country like Egypt, knowing that they have no strategic ally in the region except for us? Thank you.